Hey, my name's Matt, and this is my best attempt at quickly explaining who the Pharisees and the Sadducees are in the New Testament at the time of Jesus. To understand this, we actually have to go back to the Old Testament to get the beginnings of the story. The Jewish people had had a kingdom for a long time, but in the second half of the Old Testament, stuff started going south. And the Assyrians, a big mean people group from up north, came down and conquered them and killed and hauled off into captivity most of the Jewish people. Then the Babylonians came along in the beginning of the 500s BC and they finished the job. So there's no kingdom left in Israel, and the Babylonians now own what's left of the Jewish people, but then along come the Persians from Iran, modern day, and they defeat the Babylonians, and now they own the Jewish people. But the Persians are a little bit nicer, and so they decide they're going to allow the Jewish people to go back to Jerusalem, rebuild the city walls around that town, and rebuild their temple. Now, they won't let the Jewish people have their own king, but they will let the Jewish people govern themselves to an extent using their own religious law. So what that means is you need a new kind of leader to come along and interpret the law and figure out how to enforce the law, which is tricky because it's a religious law that you're trying to use to govern a people in its entirety. And so legal scholars come along and they grow and develop their own tradition that we'll get back to in a minute. Well, the Persian thing doesn't last long because Alexander the Great, who's Greek or Macedonian, comes and conquers the Persians, including Jerusalem and the Jewish people in the process. And Alexander's reign is very short-lived, but when he dies, his general Ptolemy takes control of the Jews in Jerusalem. And Ptolemy has the same vision for the world that Alexander did. He wants to Greekify everything. He wants people to speak Greek. He wants Greek philosophy to catch on, Greek culture to catch on. So he's pretty pushy with that, which is off-putting to the Jewish people who really like the idea of having their own kingdom again someday, and being more Greek and less Jewish feels like a step in the wrong direction. Well, give it a little bit of time, and Ptolemy eventually loses control of Judea, Jerusalem, the Jews, etc., to the descendants of another one of his rival generals, a guy named Seleucus. And the Seleucids are even more ambitious in their desire to snuff out the Jewish thing and replace it with Greek culture. Well, by this point, things are really getting tense in Israel, and some of the people start to say, like, we're not going to do these Greek things. And so the leaders, particularly one Greek leader named Antiochus Epiphanes, pushes back. He's like, no, we're going to get rid of the Jewish thing. We're going to take it even as far as me sacrificing a pig on the altar to your God. We're going to take it as far as you having to offer incense or different offerings to gods you don't believe in, or even to me. Well, the Jewish people are pretty bent out of shape, and they all get summoned to an event where they're supposed to do this sacrificing. And a dude volunteers to do it who is Jewish, and some other Jewish guys are like, no. And they kill the Jewish dude who was going to sacrifice, and it sparks this whole big giant rebellion called the Maccabean Rebellion. Long story short, the Jews win this thing, and they reestablish their own kingdom briefly in the 2nd century BC that lasts a ways into the 1st century BC. And this isn't really a restoration of their old kingdom because it's not the descendants of the great King David, who's the famous Golden Age king of Israel that everybody wanted to see, reestablished, or his line reestablished. But they got something. Well, they also still have a need to make sense of the laws that they're trying to govern their people with. So that's a little bit clumsy. But further, you've got a whole bunch of people after 200 years of Greekicizing Jewish culture who really think that in order to be on the right side of history, we need to be more Greekish. You also have a whole bunch of other people who are hyper-conservative, and they're saying, no, the thing that Israel always got wrong when we got into trouble was that we acted more like everybody else and we didn't act like a unique, set-apart people. It sounds good. And so they argue for these conservative values and a rejection of all of the Greek stuff. Well, it's a culture war. Some people are trying to lean forward, and some people are trying to get back to our roots and really make Israel great again. I'm not trying to take a side here, but if you catch my overtones, it's not that different from a lot of the tensions we feel today. Well, the liberal, legal, philosophical ruling party comes to be known as the Sadducees. They reject a lot of the supernatural teachings of the Old Testament. They don't believe in things like resurrection of the dead or miracles or angels or spirits or any of that stuff. They're very, very practical. and they view religion as something that can help provide some guidance socially, that can help steer people morally a little bit, maybe make the world a bit better place. But it's not transformative per se, and it certainly is not overwhelmingly supernatural. The Pharisees, on the other hand, these guys are really into rules, but not just for themselves. You can respect the guy who says, hey, I'm going to be really rigorous and do all this stuff. They had careful, detailed interpretations of the law, and it wasn't just them who needed to obey that, but force needed to be used so that everyone would obey their version of the Jewish religion so that the Jews could get it right, and so that, once again, they could make Israel great again. Well, it's pretty hard to imagine how these two positions can be reconciled. One rejects a bunch of supernatural stuff, the other believes all of it. One says there's no such thing as resurrection, the other says there is. And they want to see a completely different cultural outcome for their people. So they fight about this a whole bunch, and they have to fight under the same roof, which is kind of clumsy. They've got this organization called the Sanhedrin, and it's a governing council that ranged between 20-some people and 70-some people at its height, that involved a lot of these legal and religious scholars getting together to make decisions, many of which were binding at different points in history, about what ought to happen. Well, there were power shifts from time to time, and at the time of Jesus, we're talking the mid-20s to late 20s AD, you've now got a Pharisee-dominated council with a strong Sadducee minority. And the Pharisees are really grouchy at Jesus because they feel like he is not into the rules nearly enough and doesn't understand what it's going to take to get back to our Jewish roots and make things right. The Sadducees don't like Jesus very much because they think that he's on board with all of this fancy schmancy religious supernatural stuff, and he's doing miracles that they really wish he wasn't doing because it's devastating to their position. So what's interesting is that this age-old left, right, conservative, liberal thing that is going on in Israel is put on hold for just a few minutes so that these two sides can unify to make sure that they execute Jesus and many of his followers. So the Pharisees, the Sadducees together form the Sanhedrin, and these two groups are roughly the equivalents of our liberals and our conservatives, one wanting to make the world much more Greek and or Roman, the other wanting to make the world much more religiously Jewish. Hopefully that's helpful. If you have more questions, put them in the comment section, and I'll try to come up with something that sounds marginally intelligent. I'm Matt. Catch you soon.